I'm going to mispronounce this, but the rate, is it Radio
Pacis.
Pacis?
Yeah, Pacis,
Pacis?
the Latin word for peace. Yeah.
Oh, I did not
Oh,
know that. Radio Peace, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, right.
So Radio Pacis,
Yeah, good.
there you go. Radio Pacis, I had I actually had heard about them a little bit when I was in Uganda.
Okay.
I think maybe because you might have mentioned them to me, but it spoke volumes to me about the impact it had on the social transformation in many communities, and how, I mean, the people that started it were like no experience in media whatsoever, and then it turns into a 10 million people
Right.
listening. And not only did they focus on urban communities, but they really went out of their way to get some of those rural communities that, let's say, don't that aren't normally impacted by radio and media.
Right.
So can you talk a little bit about Radio Pacis and like some lessons that radio in the States, like even broadly speaking, can take, or us as a podcast or religion?
hey, we have like 10 viewers. So I'd like to get to 1 million.
You need to add a few zeros, and then then you'll catch up to them. Yeah. Well, I would say, yeah. I mean, in addition to Sister Rose, the Radio Podcast case to me also was, I just found fascinating, and it was not one I knew about. In fact, I was connected to them through a relative of my wife who had worked up in that area as a Cambodian missionary for many years. But when I started the project, I knew nothing about them, but it was just a fascinating case of using media to both proclaim the church's mission in a kind of explicitly religious way, but to also simultaneously do all of this social outreach and everything, as you read about, from empowering refugees and giving refugees literally a show to talk on, to going to local communities that need a bridge built or water, and doing community forums where they can talk directly to their political leaders. And so so it was interesting interviewing the founders. I mean, I could tell this is, again, I think maybe one of the important lessons from Catholic social thought is the way in which it needs to be embodied, right? And so both these leaders are shaped by these ideas, but then the creativity comes in how do they actually put it into practice, and the way in which they are able, I think I wrote in the book that their highest listenership is in Yumbe, which is a predominantly Muslim community, because people want truthful radio, right? I mean, we live all over the world in an era of fake news and politicization and commercial manipulation, and so people all over the world want to know what's legit. And so I think Pacis is a good example of doing best practices, learning from the best people, holding people accountable to a high standard. And yet still, I think sometimes in the States, there can be a sense like, well, if you do that, you somehow can't be religious anymore. You got to let go of that. It's like, no, like they're still doing their mass and their rosary, and they're still, I mean, they haven't lost their mission. It's just, but you can do both. And so that would, again, to your other question, I mean, that would be my message in the Western context is, let the radio really engage the community. I mean, if you're running a Catholic radio station in Omaha, be in Omaha, engage the place, and don't just engage Trump and the people who hate him, or some national cultural wars stuff that's going on. And I do think sometimes the Catholic Church in the U.S., I mean, one, in the media world, it can trend, so conservative that some of the areas of Catholic social thought that I think are really matter to people are not even talked about. But then within that, there can sometimes just be a disconnect from, I think, the lived reality of what's going on. And honestly, I think, radio really matters, especially in rural Africa. It's changing a little bit with smartphones, but still, radio matters in a way that it doesn't in the US anymore. But I do think podcasts, like what you're doing, are really making a comeback. And of course, there are religious media groups that are on that wave. But I think one of the challenges of the whole podcast world, and you guys could say more about it, is just it's like a hose of information. There are so many. And so I think one thing Radio Pacis has going for it is a kind of strong reputation and not a monopoly, but there's just not 10,000 different voices that are trying to compete. And I do think that's a challenge in modern media, is just, you could be trying to get the right message out there, but you're just one voice among, so many. But again, again, just to go back to your point, I think they are an inspiring example of trying to use media to reach people, but also to sort of improve their lives and improve their human flourishing. And my sense is that's a message that a lot of people can get on board with.